I'm a baby boomer, not that you ever could have guessed that. In my childhood and for most of my adult life, no one ever talked about mental health. No one. It must have been a conversation that was just too awkward to have, so no one had it. That may have been true in your life, too. I was so ignorant about mental illness, I didn't see it years later when I entered my own house and took up residence in my 13-year-old son. He didn't know he had a mental health problem. Makes sense when you think about it. How would you know? Just how you feel, how you react to people and circumstances. But he was suffering. He just thought it was him. And my wife and I didn't see it. My son was a great kid growing up. He did well in school. He played endlessly in the neighborhood. He loved sports. He played sports. He was a great Little League pitcher. And he was a wonderful artist from a very young age. He used to wow us with his art. And he spent a lot of time at his desk in his bedroom drawing, sometimes with the door closed. Today I would describe it as withdrawing, but I didn't know much about mental health back then. I know a lot more now. We didn't really see any signs in high school. There might have been signs, but my wife and I would not have known what to look for or what they meant. We didn't really notice a problem until he got to college and then to graduate school, got a master's degree. What we noticed was that his drinking was really excessive. And so we reached out to the alcohol experts and told them what we were concerned about. They shared our concerns. They said to us, here are some things you better be alert to. Here are some things you should be doing. And here are some choices the two of you might have to make at some point. I'm sure their advice was well-intended. We tried to follow it. It was a disaster for my family. In the middle of that chaos, my son, who had been drinking that day, assaulted me. I went to the ICU at a New Hampshire hospital. I was in the ICU for 6 or 8 days. I have no memory of that, but my wife does. My son does. I was on the Supreme Court of our state at the time, so it got a fair amount of attention, as you might imagine. My master's-educated son, decent, funny, smart, was arraigned in a public courtroom in Manchester, issued an orange jumpsuit, went to the Valley Street jail, and from there to the state prison. I still wake up some mornings at 3 a.m. with flashbacks to those times and those memories. I remember my wife telling me that she visited my son twice a week at the jail. That's what they allowed. And I was in the hospital for some of that time. And when she wasn't able to visit on those 2 assigned days, they agreed that she would go to a street corner by the jail at 3 o'clock on the appointed day, because he could see that street corner, he said, from his cell. And so my wife by herself would drive to that street corner, park their car, and wave at the jail. It's multi-stories high. She said, I didn't know what floor, what window, or even if he was looking back. She said, I always gave him a thumbs-up sign before I left that corner. And she'd get in the car and cry all the way home, or crying her way back to the hospital. When my son got to the prison, they diagnosed his problems. They said, your son has mental health problems. That's what's going on here, and we think they're treatable. We think we can treat them. Your son, they said, has been drinking. He's been self-medicating with alcohol. It wasn't a good choice, but that's the relief he found. And when they told us that in that place, I knew we had failed him. I was, after all, the parent. I should have known something about mental illness. I didn't. My son's doing well now. We love our son. I love him. He's taught us a lot about mental health. He's given me the courage to be here today, talk to all of you. My son, who was drinking every day for years, has not had a drop of alcohol in 19 years. Thank you. So why am I here? I need your help. That's why I came here today. For the last 7 years of my life, with the full support of Dartmouth Health, I've been on a journey I never could have imagined in my lifetime. It's the most important journey I've ever taken. For the last 7 years, I've driven 100,000 miles on back roads, on highways all through New England, mostly northern New England, stopping to speak to tens of thousands of kids, grades 6 through 12. I've visited 350 schools. I've spoken in their gymnasiums and auditoriums. When I started on that journey, my goal was to educate young people so they would understand, as my son didn't, that it wasn't just them. And I hoped also to educate parents who would be smarter than I was, who wouldn't fail their own child. And while I suppose I've done some of that, what's left the biggest imprint on me is the wisdom of kids. I love these kids. I've spoken to several thousand kids in a confided way after my talks. They line up to talk to this grandfather they've never met. It's quite amazing to watch. It's not me, it's this topic. They want to tell someone. I've hugged more kids with wet eyes and cracking voices in New England in the last 7 years than anyone alive. Not because I'm special, but because I was present to them. Some of those kids are varsity athletes. Some of them are honor roll students. All of them were hurting. This generation, by the way, is amazing. I love these kids. They are. They deserve your applause. They are smarter than I ever was. They're more worldly wise than I remember being. And they are the least judgmental generation in the history of the United States. But currently, anxiety and depression are epidemic among these kids. I know it. I hug it everywhere I go. I've had long rides home after emotional days on the road the last 7 years. I've had a lot of time to reflect. Why was my middle-class childhood and that of my classmates and my friends seemingly so different than a lot of the confided childhoods I'm hearing about? And I think I know now, after 7 years and the wisdom of children, I think I do know. Believe me, I understand there are a lot of reasons for mental health problems for adolescents, adverse childhood experiences, trauma of all kinds, genetics, chemical imbalance, the social determinants of health. But to be honest, much of the anxiety and depression I've been hugging, I believe, is caused by societal and cultural forces on these kids, unlike anything most of us have ever experienced. These kids are the first generation of Americans to literally grow up, in a 24/7, high-speed, high-volume, multitasking, high-achieving, alone-together virtual world. They're on their iPhones 4 or 8 hours a day, sometimes longer. Sometimes those hours are long to after midnight when parents think they're asleep. Social emotional growth comes eyeball to eyeball. That's where it comes from. Doesn't come from a screen. I'm fearful that too many kids are looking down more than they're looking up. It comes at a price. We are unintentionally, perhaps, but still we're doing it. We're shortening childhood in America. Sometimes we're chasing childhood away. It's a somewhat inconvenient time where you're not accomplishing much, you're not achieving much. We'd rather have you join the travel team, learn to play 2 instruments, learn a foreign language, improve your academic performance, join clubs. That was not my childhood. I bet it wasn't yours either. I benefited as a child from the inefficient use of time. We used to call it play. Remember that? What happened to play in America? These kids deserve that time. That's how I learned who I was, what I wanted to do before someone told me what I had to do. I learned to be independent. I learned to be resilient. I learned to solve problems. I experienced failure. It wasn't the end of my life, but I had to deal with it. I spoke one day to two varsity athletes. One was senior class president. I described my high school years to these two guys in 2 minutes. They had responsibilities, and obviously, but I had time. And when I finished, I said to the senior class president, "Can you relate to what I just said?" He said, "I can't relate to a single thing you just told me." He said, "I'm in the ice rink every morning at 5:30. I shut my light out at 11 o'clock at night. Every hour of my day is scheduled." His friend, the co-captain, was even more candid. He said, "I don't think I ever had a childhood." What is that? I wish you were with me in these schools. I didn't know we had this many schools, by the way. I've been to a lot of schools. The kids come up to me afterwards, not because I'm special, trust me, I know that. But when someone my age is saying, it's okay not to be okay, it's just not okay any longer to pretend you're okay, they come up. One day I went to a private school. Sophomore girl came up. She was sobbing so heavily I could barely understand her. She finally blurted out, "I have so many expectations on my back." Or if you've been with me in Maine, I went to a public high school one day. This girl I'm describing waited 40 minutes after my talk so she could speak to the stranger. She had the saddest face you can imagine. She told me she was a junior there. She was in all advanced placement classes. She said, "I study every night till 11:30. I have no life," she said. I said, "Why are you doing that?" She said, "To please my parents." I said, "Look, I don't know your parents. I'm sure they love you very much." She wasn't telling them. She was telling a stranger. She had to tell someone. I wish you had been with me behind that school on Nantucket Island early November 2 years ago. I was speaking to 5th through 8th grade kids. I must have looked 100 years old to them. They looked about 5 years old to me. Not a comforting feeling. But in any event, they pay attention when you mention mental health. I asked them this question, grades 5 through 8. If I could promise all of you an 89 on your next test, you can choose it. You don't have to study anymore, you'll get an 89. Or you can study all night long before the test, and you'll get a 90. How many of you would study all night long for that point? Raise your hand. Every single hand went up. What is that? Societal, cultural forces for achievement and success. And when the hands went down, a little boy raised his. He said, "I'm a 7th grader. I have a question for you." I said, "Sure, what is it?" "What would I need to do to get 100 on your test?" I thought, go to the beach. Early along in my 7-year journey, I went to one of the finest prep schools in the United States, a school that never would have accepted me and that my parents could have afforded if they did. But I went and I spoke to the entire student body there. When you become a senior in that school, most of them will apply to Ivy League schools. Many of them will be accepted. When I finished speaking that morning to the entire student body, the senior boy who introduced me stood up and asked this question. I'd never heard it asked before. If there's anyone in this auditorium, he said, who has a mental health problem, or someone you love has a mental health problem, those were the only two categories, would you please stand up? And I thought, nobody's going to stand up, not here, not now. After about 30 seconds, hundreds of kids were standing up. And by the time the standing stopped, only about 25 kids were in their seats. What is that? social, cultural stress. I told that story about 6 months later at a public high school on the seacoast of our state. And when I got to the question that I just gave you, that boy asked, I wasn't asking, I've never asked. But when they heard the question, not knowing what happened, they started standing up in that auditorium. Almost every single kid was standing up. The principal moved over to me and said, I'm shocked by this. I said, I'm not shocked now. Not now. Concerned, yes. Shocked? No. My plea to all of you, to every community, is to stop the high-speed film of everyday life and be honest about what it's showing us. Listen to your children, engage them. See the child in front of you, not the child you hope is in front of you. I don't say that, believe me, with any righteousness. I'm the last person in this room that can afford to be righteous about mental health, but I've learned a lot. The only mistake we can make, in my view, is to pretend it couldn't be our family, it couldn't be our school, or it couldn't be our community. It can be. I know that. Let me close with this. I'm really impatient for change. I'm impatient for a different conversation. There are so many people, children, who need our support. Adults too, by the way. In the 7 years I've been traveling and speaking, spoken now almost 800 times all around New England, I have never ever asked, any group of people I've ever spoken to, including kids, how's your mental health, or your friend's mental health, or your family's mental health, or what's your mental health like in your universe? I've never asked that. I always thought it was none of my business. But I am convinced, after 7 years, change demands more. If we are going to change the culture and the conversation around mental health in America, we better get about it. And the only way that'll happen is if enough of us are willing to say more publicly, my mother, my father, my cousin, my brother, my sister, my child, myself, without shame or stigma or shadows. Because I believe that to my core, I'm going to ask this room a question I have asked nowhere in the last 7 years, or frankly, throughout my entire life. Does anyone in this hall this morning who has a mental health problem, knows someone with a mental health problem, or loves someone with a mental health problem? Would you please stand up? Thank you for your courage. We need to change. Today should be the first day. Thank you very much. Thank you.